Please join me in welcoming to Google Fadiman and Lynn Stegner.
Well, my first question is, has to do with your father. He died 18 years ago, and I wonder if he might be asking, why did it take you so long?
Well, I don't think my father would be asking, why did it take me so long, because he never would have wanted me to write this book in the first place, because although it's a loving memoir, hardly a daddy dearest, it does contain some things that I know he wouldn't have wanted me to write about. Perhaps I should explain who he is. You know, but not everybody does. A recent review of The Wine Lover's Daughter was titled, "Who Was Clifton Fadiman?" And Adam Gopnik described him with the adjective, once omnipresent. And so that's both a compliment and, alas, a sad insult. He certainly is not omnipresent any longer. He's mostly a writer, but he was also, at 28, he was the editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster. At the age of 29, he was the book reviewer for The New Yorker. At 34, he was the MC of a famous radio show called Information Please. But he was mainly a writer, and I think the reason that it took me so long was that, first of all, I couldn't have written it while he was alive because I wouldn't have wanted to hurt him. And also, I think that his fame needed to decline even more year by year by year since his death, until it got to a point where I no longer felt that writing a book about him would be standing on the shoulders of his fame, but rather trying to revive it, which put me in a far more powerful role.
Well, I was thinking about that yesterday, and that this memoir is a kind of, you're lending some of your literary longevity back to him, because he wasn't able, as you say in the book, ever to complete a whole book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think he didn't do that whole book.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I have dozens and dozens of his books on my shelf, but they're all either collections of his essays. He didn't consider that a whole book. It was a collection of shorter works, or they're anthologies that he edited, or they're books by others that he wrote the foreword to or the afterword to. But he'd never completed a whole book, although he started several. I think it was part of his sense of insecurity that he didn't quite deserve to. He deserved to review books and to write forewords and afterwards to books and to edit books, but never quite to write one. An insecurity that I think came from the fact that he grew up poor in Brooklyn at the beginning of the 20th century, born to Russian Jewish immigrants in 1904. And although he became someone who seemed so patrician, a friend of mine said, "Oh my God, I always thought that your father's family must have dated back to Plymouth Rock because of his voice." And I think he felt like an actor who was really, really good at imitating people that he would never truly feel like. And that insecurity bled over into his own life as a writer. So the very fact that I have written some whole books, including this one, that part would really please him.
Yeah, you talked about his fear of the imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Of being a fake and a fraud, even though he had every pot on the stove that you could have had on in terms of the literary landscape at the time.
Yes, he was so successful. One of his favorite evidences of the reach of his influence was that when he was the MC of his big radio show, Information Please, which at its peak, more than 1/10 of the US population tuned into every Tuesday night from 8:30 to 9. By the way, just to see, gee, more than 1/10, is that a lot? I looked up the fraction of the US population that tuned into the most popular episode of Game of Thrones, 1/20th. So he beat Game of Thrones, but his favorite story about the reach of his influence was an occasion for a lawsuit. He'd asked the radio audience in his inimitably plummy voice. And now I would like to ask the men in my audience to close their eyes and see whether they can remember the color of their ties. And unfortunately, one of his listeners was driving a car and listening on the car radio and crashed into a tree. And he was fine, otherwise this wouldn't be a funny story. But I think his fender was destroyed. Yes, and he sued the show's sponsor, and my father couldn't have been more pleased because that was evidence of his effect on his listeners. Yeah. So yes, he was extraordinarily successful in any number of literary jobs he held over the years, but because when he was small, growing up sharing a bed with his two brothers over a series of failed drugstores that his father ran in Brooklyn, in poor neighborhoods, long before Brooklyn became the fashionable place it is now, because he had grown up with parents who came from Russia and spoke ungrammatical, heavily accented English. English was essentially a second language. He said that he learned it as if it were Sanskrit. And although he never went back to his earlier voice, I think he felt like someone who had learned a part rather than been born into it. One thing I found out when I was researching this was that his older brother, who went to the same public school in Brooklyn that he had, called Boys High, had been the vice president of something called the Correct English Club. And don't you think it's poignant to imagine all of these smart sons of immigrants founding a club that would help them not sound like their parents?
I think we still need that club. I want to ask a question just because growing up the daughter of a well-known, you resisted a temptation that many descendants of fame don't resist, and that is you didn't sanitize his life when you wrote a memoir of it. You really dealt with it in an even-handed way, including things like his chauvinism. I wonder if you would talk about that as his daughter.
Oh, gosh, yes. Well, reading my father's literary reviews, his put-downs of women authors and readers were more or less a continuous series of oinks from a really completely irredeemable male chauvinist pig. On the macro level, he was left-wing and liberal and in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment and sad when it didn't pass, but on the granular level, he was really condescending to women. I came across a newspaper article about a lecture that he had once given at a ladies' luncheon, at which he said, women are bad at conversation and they know nothing about wine.
And this was to a ladies' luncheon.
A ladies' luncheon at which I am sure wine was served. And perhaps I should say that the reason that the book is called The Wine Lover's Daughter is that it would have been impossible for me to write my father's biography or a kind of grandiose memoir about my father. I needed a lens that narrowed the task to something that felt doable. And books and wine were the things my father, yes, they were the things he loved most in the world, as well as for him, the most powerful symbols of that cultivated, refined life across the East River that he aspired to when he was growing up in Brooklyn. And he wrote a lot about wine. And of course, you used to run a wine company, and I've read that you have been called an organoleptic freak because you are such a remarkable wine taster. I can't say that I love wine myself, and that's one of the themes of the book, but if my father were sitting here, I can guarantee you all the rest of your questions would just end up on the floor because he would want to talk to you for an hour about great wine.
But this was a way out of escaping his origins, to quote your brother Kim.
Yes.
His affection for wine and his really deep exploration of the world of wine. How do you think, would you like him to know now what you know now, which is that you don't have genetically or physically a palate that can appreciate wine?
I'm not sure. One of the chapters toward the end of the book is about my exploration in the world of taste science. It occurred to me that perhaps my inability to love wine wasn't a character flaw, as I had assumed it was all my life. From my father's point of view, it was as if I couldn't appreciate art or music or literature, all of which, thank God, I can. But wine was in that same category of magnificent human experiences, and if you were a full human being, of course you loved it. But I found out by taking a series of tests, including genetic tests, that I have a hypersensitive palate that makes pretty much everything taste too strong, and in particular, I have a genetic variant that makes bitterness in alcohol something that tastes very intense to me. I think he would have been more likely to forgive me because it wasn't my fault, but on the whole, I think it would have been a sad thing for him to learn because he would have realized that there was no hope. You know, he believed in education. He'd been educated right out of Brooklyn.
Right.
And he kept hoping that if I just kept tasting enough wine that I would learn. That is, children don't like wine, and yet most do when they grow up. And so eventually with time it would happen. And I think he died still hoping that that moment would come for me, and knowing that it never would. Oh my God, I'm so glad I never had to tell him that.
It would have been a form of a disability.
Killed him.
Yeah.
An absolute disability. It was
Yeah.
as if he had found out that I couldn't see.
You know, he lived in New York, and at a time when psychoanalysis was in vogue. And I wonder, given the periodic depressions that he went through and this self-depreciation that he was prone to, and why he never considered going into something that everybody seemed to be doing at that time.
Oh, I think a really long psychoanalysis would have done him a lot of good. And, oh, the lucky analyst, because my father was such a great talker. He really could have lain on a couch and prevented an analyst from sleeping, I think, for at least a decade. No, he never did that. I don't think that he wished to explore his darker corners, although he was honest about their existence, at least within the family, particularly in his later years. I read a letter that he'd written to one of his closest friends when he was in his 70s, and he lived to be 95, in which he said that our culture makes it difficult, if not impossible, for children ever to really get to know their parents. Actually, that contained a split infinitive, and he would never have split an infinitive, so that is probably not a direct quote. But that was the idea. And my book was a refutation of that, but the end of his life was also a refutation of that, because he wanted to be as transparent as possible with his children so that he wouldn't die and have them feel that they'd never really got to know him. So he was really forthright, candid and honest about his flaws and his fears and his insecurities, all of which are in the book. But of course, he didn't know that I would be sharing them with however many people.
1/10 of the population.
Oh yes, with 1/10 of the population of the United States. Yes, that's the number of people who will buy this book. I feel certain, especially after this Google video.
Well, you say that toward the end of his life, he was trying to pin himself down. I love that phrase because, and he kept journals in which he explored his own sort of machinations and old motivations, and so he did a kind of his own analysis, self-analysis toward the end.
Yes, so when I said that he didn't like to explore the dark corners, I should have completely accepted the last couple of decades of his life, because then he did start exploring those corners, not with the help of a shrink, but he had terrible insomnia, and he had two ways of dealing with his insomnia. He'd do word games in his head in the middle of the night, things like, think of trees beginning with each letter of the alphabet, and go acacia, baobab, chestnut, and then he'd get to X, Y, and Z, and have I guess U for Y would work. He'd have a really hard time. So I have a feeling that these games kept him awake rather than putting him to sleep. But they were a way to while away the hours at 3, 4 in the morning. But then he would also sometimes, he's kept his journal on little scraps of paper. He'd turn the light and he'd note a little journal entry down, and then it would be typed up by his part-time secretary the next day. And I've read all of them. I'm his literary executor, so my house is just full of his stuff, which was one motivation for writing this book. I have 1,000 books of his, and all his journal and letters and tapes that I made for a profile that I wrote for him, about him, for Life magazine when he was 80. But those little journal snippets were, yes, a lot of them were about his childhood in Brooklyn, and a lot were about the feeling that you've mentioned of feeling counterfeit, duplicitous, like an actor, someone who's going to be found out any moment and booted out the service entrance because he doesn't really belong in the fancy gentleman's club.
Back to the mudroom for you.
That's exactly right.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about was, because this memoir is very balanced and not a form of hagiography, I'm wondering if that process grew out of your experience as a journalist with requirements of objectivity, or if it simply was that you could trust your abiding love for him to handle the darker aspects of his life and personality.
Well, I am a journalist, but I don't think I was ever an objective journalist. That is, all of my best work of reporting, I think, is fair and accurate, but not objective. That is, I was never a news reporter, and so in my first book, which was about a cultural impasse between a family of Hmong refugees and their American doctors, called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, I put myself in as a character and made it very clear that I had become close friends with both sides of this conflict, so that there would be no attempt at objectivity, although every attempt, as I said, at both accuracy and fairness. But I do think that when you're a journalist, you're not glossing over the difficult stuff. So it wasn't objectivity, but completeness, the desire not to paper over things that are uncomfortable. And journalism certainly taught me that, partly because the things that are uncomfortable are the most interesting. The second factor that you named, that my love for my father would somehow lead to triumph, even though I certainly revealed his flaws. And I think that was the most important thing. You really nailed it there. I loved my father very much, even though there were parts of him that were disappointing and exasperating. But I don't think it's worth writing a book about anybody, especially a parent, unless you're willing to go to those uncomfortable places. And I loved him, and in memory still love him enough, in fact, really quite superlatively, that I was sure that that love would come through to the reader, even when I was dissing him.
I want to turn to your relationship with writing, and can you tell us something about your writing process? And
Sure. Well, it's funny that I'm answering this question at Google, because I wrote most of this book in a place as un-Google-like as you could possibly imagine. I wrote some of it at the MacDowell Colony, which is a literary and artists colony in New Hampshire. But I wrote most of it at a rented one-room cabin in Northwest Massachusetts that had no internet, no landline, and no cell service. So I was completely undistracted and alone with my father, who, by the way, liked luxury and would have hated this cabin, which also didn't have any hot water and didn't have a bathroom and other things. It did have electricity. But because I was completely cut off from the world, it was a lot easier to feel that he was there because nobody was interrupting us. And as I finished each chapter, I would put its name on a Post-it and array them vertically along one of the wooden posts of the cabin. And when I put the final one at the very bottom, there was just room for the last chapter. After all those years, there were tears in my eyes thinking I'd finally got to the end.
Pinned him down.
Oh, I don't know that I could ever completely pin him down, but I guess I sure tried.
Yeah. As a writer, are there any particular battles that you feel you've won over the years of your work?
I'm not sure I ever feel I win a battle. I feel that I survive a battle, survive sufficiently to come back and fight another. Certainly, as I've gotten older, the ability just to write a perfect sentence without revision that simply, comes delivered by, Amazon Prime instantly by a winged muse. That muse, now it's sort of more like UPS ground. So I have to do more drafts. But my standards haven't lowered, so that ultimate sentence has to be just as good as it used to be. It just takes a little longer to get there. But in the case of this book, to write an entire book about someone I knew so well and loved so much and missed so much, but who was in many ways so imperfect, was a challenge I hadn't faced before. And it's so much harder to write about someone in your family than someone outside your family that you're reporting on.
You have to sort of mature away from their lived lives into lives that are becoming almost mythic in your in your heart and psyche.
That's just right.
You're a writer. Your husband is a writer too. What is it like living under the same roof with another writer?
My husband, George Howe Colt, also writes nonfiction, so not only are we both writers, but we're in the same genre. And although I teach a couple of days a week, the rest of the week I'm working at home, and he works at home, and we have lunch and dinner together every day. And we've often been asked, not only why haven't you divorced, but why haven't you killed each other by now? People assume that there's rivalry, but there isn't. It was beautifully put into words by a late friend of mine, Mark O'Donnell, also a writer, who had an identical twin, Steve O'Donnell, and they were both comedy writers. And at one point, one of them was writing David Letterman, and the other one was writing Saturday Night Live. And when one of them would get a Tony, and the other one wouldn't. Somebody said, well, Mark, when something great happens to Steve, are you jealous? And he said, no. I feel that Steve won one for the team. And so when George got his National Book Award nomination, oh my God, I wasn't jealous. He'd won one for the team. We also edit each other's work, and George often reads his work aloud to me. So that's something that will often happen at the lunch table. And I can't imagine not being married to another member of the club.
Tribe.
And so you too are married to a writer.
Yeah, but he was mostly writing nonfiction, and I was writing fiction, so we had staked out separate but equal territories.
You had your bailiwicks, and with a sort of a Berlin Wall between.
Well, it was a bunting board, let's say.
Okay. Oh, a bundling board. That's wonderful. So people who don't know what a bundling board was, the Puritans would have unmarried couples. This actually sounds sort of racy. Keep each other warm in bed, but with something called a bundling board between them, so there could be no physical contact whatsoever. But yet you could have conversation.
You could talk. You
sort of Pyramus and Thisbe through the wall, hole in the wall. So yes, the bundling board between you and your husband. That's just that's the loveliest metaphor.
And we did edit each other's work too.
Yeah.
So that's a real lucky.
Yes.
It's a lucky circumstance for a writer to have a built-in, homegrown editor on the property.
And so inexpensive.
So inexpensive, exactly. This is a classic question, but it's always an interesting one, and that is, what writers or books have most influenced you?
Well, I majored in the history and literature of England in college. I went to a college that actually had a major called history and literature. And so the great 19th century writers probably influenced my prose style. Middlemarch is probably my favorite book, and I think you can learn more about human psychology from Middlemarch than from most psychology textbooks. I recently read did the audiobook for this book, and it was the first time that I had been the narrator of one of my books, and it turned out to be much harder than I had expected. And as I was in this little studio, I found myself saying to myself, why does that writer write such long sentences? And why are there so many parentheses? And so I'm sure 19th century British literature was that influence, but I'm very much influenced, I guess, by the great writers of literary journalism, John McPhee, Ian Fraser, Joan Didion, and McPhee has probably been my longest lasting influence. I remember reading the first third of Encounters with the Arch Druid my freshman year in college, and it was a genre that I had never encountered before, and there it was in the New Yorker, and it was just as if a tsunami had come over me, and I thought, oh my God, I would love to do that.
That's what you want to do. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a great essay and great book. I think
Yes.
I read it at about the same time. McPhee actually includes one of your essays as one of the 10 greatest essays ever written, an essay from Ex Libris entitled Marion Libraries, and it is one of my favorite too, and I use it actually in a class I teach. But what I love about it most is the unity of form, content, and narrative voice. It's just everything is fused beautifully in that short essay.
Oh, thank you. Marion Libraries was about what happens when two writers, each with a whole lot of books, get married and have to marry their libraries. And at first we lived together, and then we got married, and then we married our libraries. That was a much bigger step, because after we mingled our books and had to throw out the duplicates and decide whose would go, we really couldn't get divorced. I mean, that was a far bigger commitment than any marriage vows. But yes, when John McPhee put that essay on his little list of the best essays, that was one of the best moments of my life. It was like God speaking and tapping me on the head.
You get to enter heaven now.
Yes, I was in heaven at that moment, and even just hearing you say it just brings me back to the moment when I first found that out.
I have a question about, all of your books contain a very rigorous, long sources section. And I wonder if you could footnote for us your devotion to footnotes and sources.
Sure. Well, it's partly that I'm very interested in being accurate. So this book has no made-up quotations. Everything is verbatim or very close to verbatim. Everything my father says is either quoted from something that he wrote, either published or from his journal or from a letter, or something that I taped or took notes on. And so I wanted the reader to know that, because most memoirs are full of reconstructed quotes, because if somebody said something 30 years ago, how could you remember it verbatim? I also thought that readers might be interested in, if they were interested in a particular, so there's a chapter about my father's feelings about being Jewish. He encountered a great deal of anti-Semitism when he was young and at Columbia. And if anybody is interested in reading about anti-Semitism at Columbia during the 1920s, well, there are the sources at the back of the book. Also, I love research. And so maybe it's I think the length maybe was a specific response to something that one of my Yale students said. And as I was just about to start the source notes, I told this student, over this winter break, I'm going to work on the source notes for my memoir about my father. And he said, a memoir? Would that have source notes? And I thought, oh my God, yes. It took me years to do all of this research. So maybe I just wanted a little trail of evidence of all that sweat.
Well, and you also write, there's also an essay that you wrote called Nothing New Under the Sun, in which you let the form mimic your attentiveness to, and it's a really irritating piece to read. As wonderful, I mean, it's supposed to, it's a gag in a way,
yeah.
because every sentence you write has a footnote.
Is footnoted.
You have to stop and go down and look at the footnote and go back to sources, and by the end of the essay, we're shaking our fists at you.
I wanted you to shake your fist. Yeah, that's an essay about plagiarism in Ex Libris. The idea being that everybody always plagiarizes everything because there's nothing new under the sun, and therefore every single sentence in the essay had some source or another, and everything was footnoted. This book is not footnoted because I didn't want to interrupt the narrative and make readers shake their fists at me, but I do have source notes at the end.
Well, should we take some questions from the audience?
Sure.
Is this a good time, Dave? Okay, great. Let's talk about, go back to wine a little bit. Oh, I wanted you to read a couple of excerpts.
Oh, sure.
So let's hear that opening to Oakling.
Okay, yes, and I have an Oakling question then for you. So you're about to learn a term. I'm really hoping that if this book does nothing else, it introduces the word Oakling to the American vocabulary. A few years ago, I wrote an essay about Hartley Coleridge, a 19th century British poet who had the bad luck to be the son of a far more famous poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Hartley started off as a celebrated wunderkind and ended up a penniless alcoholic who often spent his days in alehouses and his nights in ditches. A review of the only book of Hartley's poetry published in his lifetime allowed that it manifested no trivial inheritance of his father's genius, a sincere compliment, if one that implied he had no genius of his own, but also cited an old adage: "The oakling withers beneath the shadow of the oak." I am interested in oaklings because I am one myself. When writers beget writers, there are, of course, some advantages. There are plenty of books in the house. There's an example right under your nose that words are a plausible way to earn a living. There's the intimacy that comes when you and your parents like the same things and are both good at them. But despite the perks, oaklings face a universally acknowledged problem. The mighty oak grabs all the sunlight. One solution is relocating yourself as far as possible from the shadow. My brother and my half-brother chose not to become writers. They were thereby saved the angst of Nick Harkaway, John le Carré's youngest son, who said that becoming a writer would feel as pointless as standing next to a lighthouse and waving a flashlight. Like me, he became one anyway. So an oakling, the notion that the oakling, the writer offspring of the famous writer parent, is always going to be smaller than the oak is something that everyone in my position struggles with. So a terrible compliment to give to the writer offspring of a famous writer parent is, "Oh, you're a chip off the old block," because no chip has ever been as large as a block. So you're more or less an oakling by marriage, Lynn. Your father-in-law was Wallace Stegner. So partway through your life, all of a sudden, you had a famous last name, and you too were a writer. What has that sort of oakling-in-law-dom been like for you?
Well, mostly it's been wonderful. As I said, I had built-in readers, and both my husband and father-in-law, but it did hold me. That tribe, that family tribe, held me to a higher standard. Other people held. So my first book, which was a first book, and necessarily flawed in certain ways, you know, I had my agent sent it out under my maiden name. And then they asked, actually it wasn't even my maiden name, it was my first name and my middle name, and when they decided to take the book, they said, "Would you mind using a different name?" Because they didn't, and I said, "Well, that's actually not my name." And so they were very happy. So there were advantages and disadvantages.
Oh, but I admire you for making sure that it was being acquired by a publishing house on its own merits. That's such an interesting story, because when I was a young writer, I considered using my mother's maiden name. That is, I considered calling myself Anne Whitmore. She had been Anna Lee Whitmore, because I also didn't want anyone to think that I was trading on my father's name. And I pondered it for a few months, and then I thought, but I'm not Anne Whitmore. I'm Anne Fadiman. I'm a Fadiman just as much as my father is a Fadiman.
Yeah.
That's me. Why should I have to change who I am?
Yes, you say, he had my genes too.
That's right. He had my genes too. Yes. So it seems to me that we shared genes. They were verbal genes. His two brothers also were very verbal. My brothers are very verbal. We all shared the same genes. So we inherited those genes from, great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, and people who simply say, oh, you've got your father's genes, as if there was absolutely no creativity or originality or even work on my part. Oh my God, it's exasperating. But I'm so admiring that you sold your first book not under the name Stegner.
And then they were very happy when they
learned.
Oh,
I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were.
Here's a question I wanted to ask earlier, and that is, your father's life effectively bookends the 20th century.
Yeah.
1904 to 1999.
There's the 20th century for you.
There's the 20th century. So do you think a Clifton Fadiman would be possible in this century, in Americas today?
No. Oh, good question. No. My father's life as a public intellectual really was the cultural life of the 20th century. And I think that there are two reasons why, if somebody like him were alive today, he would not be successful. One was that my father was essentially didactic. He'd always wanted to be an English professor, didn't get to be because Columbia said that it had one spot for a Jew, and it was going to his best friend Lionel Trilling. So much for his academic career. But he was still always the explainer. He wrote a book about, the 100 greatest books you should read in your life, called the Lifetime Reading Plan. He was a judge at the Book of the Month Club. That sort of didactic, explaining. People between the wars, and I would say also in the 1950s, wanted to better themselves. And people now don't want anybody to say, here are the 100 greatest books you should read. They might want to read a self-help book about how to make more money, or how to do better on Match.com, but not what books to read. So that didactic strain wouldn't go over. And the other was that, boy, he was really an old white male. The Lifetime Reading Plan, 100 books, 97 by men, 99 by white writers, 100 by Western writers. So it seems to me that in today's more diverse culture, which I'm very interested in myself, he would be an anachronism, and in some ways should be.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. But at that time, our country needed a cohesive, unifying voice of culture.
Yes.
After the war, especially.
That's right.
So
he was it.
He was it.
He was it.
And the radio, especially, reached that broader audience.
That's right.
Yeah.
All of whom I think felt somewhat elevated, because the level of wit and repartee on Information Please was so high.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of their guests were from show business, they were all people who were really smart. And it was not a polarized time. Just last week, I happened upon an old newspaper piece about my father. This isn't mentioned in the book. In 1940, he was talking to a luncheon of alumni of the University of North Carolina, and it was the fall, and just before the election, and FDR was running for his third term against Wendell Willkie. And one of the women in the audience said, "Who was your favorite guest ever on Information Please?" And expected him to say, Groucho Marx, or Boris Karloff or whatever. And he said it was Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was the best informed and most charming man I ever had on the show. Of course, I'm voting for FDR. And the notion that in those days you could say something so respectful about the guy you weren't voting for just made me sigh. Yeah. So that was the kind of reaching out to an audience to try to bring them up to his level of education and civility. So I think people always felt that they could stand a little taller after listening to him, but not as if they'd had a boring, 10th grade English class, because he was just so damn funny.
Yeah, he was funny. Back to the wine. Prohibition was repealed in 1933.
Yes, that's right.
In 1935, he began his extensive wine cellar.
That's right.
Yeah. And so, in effect, he was kind of a pioneer in a country whose wine fields had been laying fallow for almost 14 years.
14 years, yeah.
So
right.
How did he sort of get that all going when there were no sources of information or...
Well, he'd had his first glass of wine in Paris. He couldn't get one here, Prohibition. He was the editor of Simon & Schuster. He commissioned somebody to write a book about wine. But wine, of course, was all French wine. He learned about French wines, and on the first day that he felt ready to start collecting, he bought 908 bottles, as I discovered when I found his cellar book, and Chateau Lafite Rothschild cost $1.75 a bottle.
Alas. Shall we take some questions? Yeah.
What's that worth now?
Oh, God, you'd have to be a billionaire. And of course, many of those wines that he bought in 1935 were from 1929, which, of course, was probably the greatest year for wine ever. Nobody quite knew that yet because it was only 6 years earlier. The Lafite Rothschild, I think, was 28, but I know that he bought Chateau Margaux for $25 a case from 1929. That's $2.08 a bottle.
That's baffling. So...
Is there a question there? Oh.
You will. We'll pass. Yeah, I'll pass it. So this question's for Anne. So
Okay.
I know that you mentioned that the 18th century British writers really influenced your style.
19th century.
Or sorry, 19th century.
Oh, the 18th century people were really dry and dull. The 19th century were the Romantics and then the Victorians. Oh, very different.
So sorry, 19th century.
Yeah.
But what I was actually going to bring up was the 18th century. So
Sure.
I know that you have a little bit of an affinity for the Romantics, and you have an essay about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your appreciation for him.
Sure. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge, mostly writing in the early 19th century, was a group of, among the Lake poets. William Wordsworth was also in that group. He was the father of Hartley Coleridge, the poet I mentioned earlier, who was essentially called an oakling because he grew up withering beneath the shadow of this great oak. And I'm particularly interested in Coleridge's life because he spent much of it running away. My essay in a book called At Large and at Small is called Coleridge the Runaway. And he ran away by becoming an opium addict. He ran away from his marriage. He ran away through procrastination. And at one point, he just ran away from England, where he had disappointed a great many people personally and professionally, and ran away to Malta, where he worked as a sort of junior diplomat. And yet, despite the fact that he was so disorganized and could never face any difficulties, he was incredibly productive and one of the greatest poets ever. And I'm so interested in process that I was fascinated to think about how could you be so great and so productive when you were so messed up?
Well, I'd like to ask if, I'll preface this by saying my hobby's writing. I'm working on a bunch of short stories.
Great.
I've started a new Well, I haven't finished my first novel yet, but I started another one fresh for NaNoWriMo. I'd just like to know if you have any advice for aspiring writers.
Sure. Well, I was talking about this in the car here, and I was lucky enough to have a marvelous author escort driving me in my car who's sitting here. And she said, well, you know, I was writing something for my work just yesterday and it wasn't really that good. I just don't think I could ever be a writer. And I said, if you wrote 20 drafts like me, you could. And I think most people don't know how good they could possibly be, at least on the sentence level, because they write a sentence in an email and they go, that's okay. Well, my emails aren't that great either, because I'm not rewriting the sentence 20 times. But I also think that the best advice for an aspiring writer, beyond rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, is reading and rereading and rereading. I've always felt that if they had a psychology experiment and they put one guy on a desert island with an unlimited amount of paper and pencils for 5 years, and then on the next island they had a guy marooned with an unlimited library for 5 years. I'm not suggesting this is an experiment. I think the psychological profession probably would ban it, but I'm convinced that the guy on the island with the books would probably be a better writer at the end of 5 years, even though he hadn't been able to write a word.
That brings me to a question I wanted to ask, and that is, how does teaching affect your writing?
I teach creative nonfiction at Yale. It mainly distracts me from my writing because it means I can write only in the summers, but my students' writing is so good that I'm convinced I'm contributing more to American literature by teaching writing for most of the year than by writing more books during my lifetime, because my students become such marvelous writers. It's not that my teaching makes them such marvelous writers. They're already on that trajectory, but if in a few cases I could give that final nudge that might make them say, yes, I have the courage to do this because somebody said I was really good. So they're so good that they inspire me, and they keep me fresh as I get older. They stay the same age. It's amazing. The new crop comes in, and they're just forever young, and they keep me young. It's sort of
in the conversation. You're still in that conversation.
In the conversation, yes. They never shut up, and they never let me shut up, and that's the best thing about it.
Okay, I have one more question. This one's for Lynn. So I'm going to actually ask you the same question that you asked Anne, which is, who are your favorite writers, and what is your favorite book? Where do you draw inspiration from?
I'm still filling in gaps in my education. And so I tend to read books, great books that they're all on your father's reading list. But American writers that really have influenced me are William Styron, Hemingway's short stories, not his novels. But then Dostoevsky. I read all of the world's, I think, existential writers for a period of time, Sabato and Camus, of course, and others. So I think it's all over the map, but I don't read a lot of really new fiction. It's like waiting for a new app to go through point 1, point 2, point 3. I wait a while before I pick up new books.
Or like a great vintage. A really great wine is not at its best in the year that it's produced, as you well know.
Yeah.
You have to wait until it matures.
Yeah, and goes through its awkward periods.
Through its awkward periods. Yeah, Chateau Mouton Rothschild, sort of version 0.01, 0.02,
right.
0.03.
Wait till you get to point 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. How are we for time?
I think we're okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
All right.
May I just end with something about my father and Google? I was talking with my brother Kim before I came out here to California, and I said that I was going to be doing this talk at Google. And he reminded me that my father's math professor at Columbia, about whom he told many stories when we were growing up, was Edward Kasner, who invented the term Google. spelled Googol. And my brother reminded me that we'd heard from our father that Kasner had been on a walk with his young nephew Milton. And Kasner had said, "Milton, what would be a good word for a really big number? Let's say 1 followed by 100 zeros." And little Milton said, "What about Google?" It was a made-up word. Kasner spelled it Googol, but that was the inspiration for Google. And my father had a marvelous mental game, another mental game that he would play inside his head in the middle of the night when he had insomnia. And it was called I Shook Hands with Shakespeare. And he would imagine somebody like Shakespeare who'd lived a long time ago, and he would imagine people that he had known, shaken hands with, and then somebody that that person might have known, going back to the previous generation, somebody that that person might have known him, try to get himself all the way back to sort of shaking hands virtually through the centuries with some great writers. And so now that all of you are here listening to me, and I am the daughter of my father, and my father was the student of Edward Kasner, I feel that Google is shaking hands with Google.
You're the missing link.
I am the missing link. I have restored it.
Well, thank you, Anne, Lynn. Thank you for coming. Let's give them one more round of applause.
Thank you.